And so about our speaker, Gregg, who I just met, is one of the leading experts in the country in Japanese approaches to mental health. He has mastered the disciplines that originate in Japanese Buddhist traditions, in particular Naikan and Bodhisattvas therapy, and has demonstrated that these disciplines offer spiritually invigorating and eminently practical complements or alternatives to standard Western therapies. Gregg is the author of many books, including Naikan, Gratitude, Grace, and the Japanese Art of Self-Reflection, A Natural Approach to Mental Wellness, Japanese Psychology, the skills we need for psychological and spiritual health, The Art of Taking Action, Lessons from Japanese Psychology, and most recently, Question Your Life, Naikan, Self-Reflection, and the Transformation of Your Stories. Gregg's wife, Linda, is with us today. Linda is a co-founder with Gregg of the Kodo Institute in Vermont that has introduced Japanese psychology and skills for mental well-being to thousands through retreats, workshops, and distance learning. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Gregg to talk to us today about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So it seems like we have kind of a merger of psychology and religion here. So how many of you are kind of more on the psychology side of the midpoint? Okay, and how many of you are more on the religion side of the midpoint? Neat. So one of the curious things, I'm going to talk about something called Naikan, which is sometimes referred to as Naikan therapy in the article you had. By the way, I'm not sure we have more copies, but there are copies of this little journal up here. If you didn't get a copy of that, you're welcome to on your way out. And we might have some extra copies of the handout if you didn't get one. But the curious thing about Naikan, which is a Japanese term that means inside looking or looking from the inside, it's a method of self-reflection, is that it began as a spiritual practice that came from its roots in Pure Land Buddhism in Japan. But because of the success that it had in terms of the experience people had with it in Japan, the mental health profession got very interested in it, and then ultimately took it on and added the word therapy to it. So it's now both a spiritual practice and a psychotherapeutic modality in Japan. And so you could go and you could basically do a Naikan program or a retreat or something in Japan at a Buddhist temple, or you could go and you could do it at a mental health clinic. And in one case you would be dealing with a Buddhist priest, in the other case you might be dealing with a psychologist or psychiatrist, and what you would do in those places would be virtually the same thing. So it's a very unusual kind of thing to have something that is functioning as both psychotherapy as well as a spiritual practice. So let me begin by just thanking the people who made it possible for me to be here, and that includes Jamie Hubbard and Carol. All the people who made it possible aren't here because they're sick, so I don't know how to think about that, but Jamie Hubbard and Carol Zaleski were really just wonderful in terms of supporting me, and Phoebe also did a great job of handling all my logistics. And the person who kept me alive for 4 hours driving down from Vermont this morning is my wife, who did a wonderful job of driving through sleet and mountain passes and 30-mile-an-hour gusts of wind. And I particularly want to thank the person on Craigslist who sold us the studded tires, snow tires on our Subaru, because I never realized that after April 15th, those would come in so handy. So it's just another example of being rewarded for procrastination, because we didn't get our tires changed over. Let's see. I've got two monitors here, so I'm just going to see if I can work in tandem. Anybody here who actually knew Reverend Uno when he was here? You did. Wonderful. Anyone else? So when I first started talking to Jamie about coming down, and we both found out that we had this kind of common ground in Reverend Taitetsu Uno, who was professor in the religion department here for many years, And Jamie described him as one of his mentors, and even though I didn't know Thai nearly as well, we used to converse regularly about Japanese psychology and about Naikan, and several times I came down here and spoke with his Sangha, his Pure Land Sangha that he had started in the Northampton area. But he wrote several books, and he, I think, made this, in the last 50 years of his life, made this monumental contribution to Pure Land and Shin Buddhism in the United States. Most people are familiar with Zen because Zen is so popular in the United States. But if you go to Japan, actually, from a standpoint of people who practice a particular sect of Buddhism, Shin Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, is the most popular religion in Japan. And often it surprises people because Zen has really taken such root here. So this is a quote from an interview that we actually did with Thai for our journal years ago. He says, "I believe it's important to distinguish between the academic study of Buddhism, history, doctrine, philosophy, and the practical application of Buddhist teachings to everyday living with its many challenges. In recent years, my focus has been on the latter, trying to apply Buddhist principles to resolving conflicts with the family, workplace, organizations that depend on people working together." And I know from speaking to him that that really was a shift in the theme of his life. He very much shifted to even someone who was revered as a teacher, shifted to a very personal experience with this form of Buddhism. So it's a wonderful quote to introduce this, because what I'm going to present to you is something that I think is very practical and has wonderful applications in terms of everyday living, from a standpoint of marriages, from a standpoint of cultivating a sense of gratitude, from a standpoint even of rehabilitation for people who have addiction problems. So there's a variety of things where I think this can enter into our day-to-day life, but most of all in terms of our relationships with others, families, friends, people we work with. So I'm going to take a little survey, if you would be willing to participate. I'm just going to ask you about 3 questions, and I want you to answer those questions in your mind, okay? And you don't have to raise your hands or say anything. So the first question is, how many of you, when you look at your family and extended family, know someone, which might include yourself, who is divorced or separated? Okay? So you just plant that answer in your mind. How many of you, when you think about your family and extended family, find at least one person, again it could include yourself, where there's a family estrangement, where there's defined as like somebody who has cut off contact and communications with another or several members of the family? So you can think if you know somebody like that or several people like that. And how many of you, in terms of your family network, know somebody who has been subject to domestic violence by an intimate partner? So that'll give you your own sense of kind of your personal connection to these issues. When we look at divorce, and it's a pretty common statistic, so you've probably seen this before, the divorce rate in this country is somewhere between 42 and 45%. It's actually kind of controversial in terms of how to calculate that and whether it's actually going down or up. But one aspect of it is that there's been a 400% increase in divorce in the age group between 55 and 65 in the last 20 years. So that's my age group. Linda, don't get any ideas from that statistic. And we also know that the people are at greatest risk for divorce tend to be people at the lower levels of education, particularly those people without a college degree. But the overall statistic is somewhere where about half the people, a little less than half the people who get married are going to get divorced. The family estrangement is an example of something that less people are familiar with, and there hasn't been as much research on until recently. And so, for instance, they did a study in England, and they found that about 19% of the people could identify someone in their family or family network who was estranged from other people in their family. About 1 out of every 5 people could identify someone. You may have identified somebody. But there's been several other studies that indicate that that rate may be as high as 46%, in the sense that when we look at a family, we can identify within that family network almost half those families have some kind of pairing or connection in there where there's been a severing of communication and contact with another member of the family. And then domestic violence. That they estimate that for women, about 1 out of every 4 women have experienced severe violence from their intimate partner, severe violence. And about 15% of men have experienced severe violence from their intimate partner. So when we put those 3 statistics together, you know, I think what we see is basically a society, particularly the family structure of our society, in which it's really very hard for people to get along. You know, we talk about how divided our country is right now politically, but I think even before that, we really are experiencing a situation where within families, it's just harder and harder for people to basically be able to have relationships with people, whether it be their intimate partners or siblings or parents. It's just a growing difficulty, and we see more and more of this increase in terms of conflict and estrangement within family systems. This is a quote from an Indian meditation teacher by the name of Eknatheshwaran. Some of you may be familiar with him. Puffed up by our self-will, we look out at the world through the distorting medium of our likes and dislikes, hopes and fears, and opinions and judgments. We want everyone to behave as we think they should, the right way. When naturally enough, they not only behave their own way, but expect us to do as they do, we get agitated. And what we see through this agitation makes up our everyday reality. I think that one of the most interesting things I came across, you know, given the level of conflict and difficulty in relationships and understanding one another, is a whole new strategy of terrorism that came from a man named Sebastian Junger, who's a war correspondent and an author. If you know of him, he wrote the book The Perfect Storm, but he's also a very well-known war correspondent. And he's actually suggesting that the United States is so powerful that the only country capable of destroying her might be the United States herself, which means that the ultimate terrorist strategy would be just to leave the country alone. That way, America's ugliest partisan tendencies could emerge unimpeded by the unifying effects of war. The ultimate betrayal of tribe isn't acting competitively, that should be encouraged, but predicating your power on the excommunication of others from the group. So does Buddhism from the East offer any kind of possible solution to help with this situation where we can't seem to get along with each other in our society? And I would say yes, but not from a doctrinal or a philosophical standpoint, in my opinion, but from what Tai Uno was talking about in terms of a practical application to our relationships in our daily life. And so that's really what I want to offer you tonight, is my view of what I think can be helpful, both at a societal level, but also at a very individual and personal level. And I'm not a scholar, and what I'm going to present to you in large part is my own personal experience, both as someone who worked with this material in their own life and now as somebody for the last 30 years who's basically been working with other people using these methods. So Naikan is a Japanese word that means something like inside looking or looking from the inside. So it's a method of self-reflection that comes from Japan. I prefer the more poetic translation seeing oneself with the mind's eye. In 1988, I went to Japan to basically take a 2-week retreat in a place called the Senkobo Naikan Center. And the center was run by a Japanese priest by the name of Reverend Shuei Usami, who was ordained both as a Pure Land Buddhist priest and as a Rinzai Zen priest. And the center was a Naikan center that also was a Buddhist temple. So I spent 2 weeks there, and a total of about 200 hours reflecting on my life. And that involved sitting on a cushion facing a blank white wall in a large hall with other people doing the same thing, and basically reflecting on every year of my life as much as I can remember, and every single meaningful relationship of my life, with my mother, with my father, with my brother, my grandparents, my ex-girlfriends, my current girlfriend, my teachers. So every person I had had a meaningful relationship with was basically the subject of that kind of self-reflection. And at the end of those 2 weeks, I came away with a very different understanding of my life as I had lived it and who I was, and even what I needed to do. But one of the things that changed was several of my stories. For example, the story I had before I went to Japan to do this work was the story of family violence, because there was family violence in my family when I was growing up. And, and that was evident because we had episodes where people were injured, sometimes going to the hospital, where police were called several times to come and intervene. And so that became my story about my childhood. And if I was dating a girl or something and we got to know each other and we were kind of sharing personal histories, you know, I would tell my family violence story. It was very dramatic, and it was true. But when I went to do this 2-week reflection and I actually looked at my experience as a child, it wasn't that there wasn't family violence, but what I started to see was what happened in between the family violence, which were things like I was given swimming lessons, I was allowed to play baseball, my father coached my Little League team, I went to a good school, I had books, I had a bicycle to ride, I got my driver's license and my parents helped me learn to drive, I got eyeglasses when I couldn't see very well, and on and on and on. And it wasn't that the story of family violence wasn't true, it's just that there was a lot more to that story that I was leaving out. And so when I left, it really changed my relationship with my parents. I had been a very rebellious kid. I ran away from home as a teenager and had a very difficult relationship with my father. We didn't speak to each other a whole year. He never came to my high school graduation as a result. So it was not a friendly relationship, and yet at the end of those 2 weeks I wrote both my parents long letters of thanks, not because anybody told me to, just because in my heart I felt like it's really something that I needed to do. And that relationship change lasted for about 30 years, 25 to 30 years, at which point both my parents died. And with my father, I was with him next to his deathbed for the last 2 weeks of his life. And just basically we had this close relationship that would have, I think, never happened had I not had this experience. And though I wasn't with my mother when she died, we also had a much improved relationship. It was more stressed, but every time I would talk to her on the phone and I would feel agitated by her, and I would remember that one of my assignments when I was doing the Naikan reflection was I was given 2 hours to calculate how many dirty diapers my mother changed for me, or my parents changed, from the time I was born until I stopped wearing diapers. And so I'd be mad at her, and then I'd also be thinking about that number at the same time, and it would soften me. It would basically, it never kept me from kind of being agitated or bothered or frustrated with her, but it kept us in a loving connection, even amidst some of that stress and tension, in a way that we could have a relationship for those 30 years. And the other thing that it did, it changed my relationship with women. I had had a series of girlfriends from the time I was in high school, and I realized when I did my reflection that I was kind of a real jerk as a boyfriend. And now I just hope that my daughter, who's in college, doesn't find somebody like that, like me, to be her boyfriend. But at that time, I had a long-distance relationship with this woman in New York. And about a year or two after I got back from my first retreat, we got married. She's sitting right there today. Oop. So what is self-reflection? Self-reflection basically involves pausing. It involves stopping and examining ourselves, how we've been living, what we've been doing. It involves learning from our experience. But if I had to put it into a single word, it's a pause. Self-reflection is a pause. And unfortunately, most of us have such busy lives that we don't take time for that pause. That we basically spin our lives back and forth between being active and passive, right? We work, we do all the stuff that we need to do, go through our checklist to make sure that everything's getting done by the end of the day. And then what happens, we're exhausted and we kind of zone out in front of Facebook or the internet or TV or something in a very passive way. So we're active and we're passive, but often there's really no room in which we're reflective. And so I'm going to make an argument that making room, even if it's just for a short period of time, even just a matter of minutes per day, can make a huge difference in our lives and in our relationships with people. This is a quote from D.T. Suzuki. He's often credited with the person who brought Zen to the US from Japan. Spiritual life begins from introspection. Without it, there can be no spiritual life. Introspection is denial. It occurs when a person who's gone wholeheartedly and directly straight forward without looking to the rear or the right or the left, questions, stops, holds his ground, and looks to himself and his situation. When I wrote my first book on Naikan and I was researching it, I was looking for other approaches to self-reflection than what I had experienced. And what I found is that virtually every religious or spiritual tradition encourages self-reflection, supports self-reflection, but when you actually look for methodologies meaning the mechanics of how would you do this, right, if you want to reflect on yourself, that there are actually very few methodologies, but there's lots of support for the idea of self-reflection. And so some of those actual structured approaches include the 12-step program, right? If some of you are familiar with that, the fourth step is the step in which you make a fearless and searching moral inventory of your life. So that's part of the process of going through the 12-step program. There was Ben Franklin had a secular approach towards self-reflection that involved a method of self-development in which he identified 12 qualities that he wanted to cultivate in himself. Right? And they might be things like orderliness, and this is the 18th century, so orderliness, timeliness, frugality, those kinds of things. He had a list of 12 of those things. And what he would do is he would take one quality and he would work on it for the week. And at the end of the day, in the evening, he would look back on his day, he would reflect on his conduct, his behavior, and he would decide whether he had met his own standards for that particular quality. And if he had, he'd put a check mark on his little notebook. And if he hadn't, he wouldn't put the check mark there. And so as the story goes, he was at a social gathering once with a number of friends, and he was describing this system to a friend of his who was a Quaker. And the Quaker friend listened very respectfully, and at the end said to Franklin, well, I'd like to suggest a 13th quality that you could work on. And Franklin said, well, what would that be? And the Quaker friend said, humility. And to Franklin's credit, he actually added that to his list. And so he now had 13 qualities. And he would do one per week. So if you do the math, He could cycle through all 13 in 13 weeks, and he could cycle through 4 times through each of those cycles in the course of a year. And at the end of his life, they actually found these little notebooks. Notebooks were valuable at that time, so at the end of 13 weeks, he would just erase the check marks in many cases. Then he could use that same notebook page over again. But he found, they found a number of these notebooks in which every day he was reflecting on whether he was meeting his own expectations in terms of the qualities he wanted to cultivate. And apparently, late in his life, he said that he felt that it was a good system and that he made progress on every one of the qualities but one. And the one quality he felt he really never made progress on was humility. Juju Kinkai, for those of you who are interested in Buddhism, is another form of self-reflection that kind of comes from Buddhism, and it's a reflection on the precepts. So it's a reflection in which one goes through and looks at one's conduct in relation to the Buddhist moral precepts like not killing, not stealing, not lying, many of them very similar to the 10 Commandments. And then the Examen is a method of self-reflection in Christianity that was developed by St. Ignatius of Loyola. So that's another example. Did you have a comment?
No, wait till the end.
No, go ahead.
Does Buddhism describe what lying means and stuff that's not as objective as killing? Although that could be subjective too, I guess. But yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if Buddhism describes it in that detail, but when I did my reflection, when I did Juju Kinkai in Japan, I was given a list of possible ways to interpret, for instance, each precept like lying. So when we think of lying in a very kind of direct way, it's like just telling you something that's not true. But it was saying you can also lie by withholding information, right? You can also lie if someone has an assumption about you or something about your life, and you know the assumption's not true and you don't correct them. So it provided a whole list of ways that we can somehow lie.
And were they absolutes, or does it leave room for, like, how specific does it get? Like, does it leave room for lying for reasons that are fulfilling your intention of the day?
Well, it's always raised as a question, and one thing that you would find in this process is that what you're getting are questions. And so ultimately, the question of whether you lied or didn't lie, for instance, in this approach, is something that you have to decide, right? So if you feel like, you lied, but you lied to protect somebody, and therefore it wasn't really a lie, then you just basically don't indicate it to yourself as a lie. So it's a situation where you're not accountable for your reflections to anybody but your own heart, or to Buddha, or to God, or however you want to think about it. And so part of what I really responded to in the process of Naikan is that what I was given was questions, and however I answered those questions was accepted. Because I was so rebellious in my younger years, if I would have been in a situation where I felt I was being pushed to answer in a certain way, or what I was saying wasn't accepted, I would have immediately put up defenses. But because I could essentially use this process in whatever way came up, and it was just basically okay, then I wasn't in a situation where I had to defend myself. And that's really important, both therapeutically, if we look at it from the psychological side, and spiritually, is that the person who's on the other side of you is simply a listener and an acceptor, if you want to think of it that way, not somebody who is analyzing or judging you in terms of what you're coming up with. So when I get more into the material, I can address, you'll get a better sense of that. So what I want to do tonight is, rather than just talk about this, is to give you a chance to actually experience it. So if you were to go do a retreat, we just finished a retreat, and we do exactly what I just described I did in Japan, except it's for 1 week. And if you were to do a retreat, you would do exactly what I did. You would, it's a little bit cushier in the United States than it is in Japan, but you would basically sit on cushions unless you had back problems. Then you could sit on a chair. You would be behind shoji screens, and you'd have about 100 hours of reflection time to reflect on your life. And that's what you would do the whole week. Your meals are brought to you, your laundry's clean for you. You don't have anything else to do for that week but to reflect on your life. And so I want to give you a chance to do that today, even though we only have a few minutes. So I'm going to give you 3 questions to work with over the course of the talk here, and you'll have about 5 minutes for each question. And then you can get a little taste of what this involves and how it might work. The most important thing for people who want to go through a process of self-reflection or self-examination to me is a questioning spirit, right? You have to go into this as an investigation. So if I ask somebody, for instance, how well do you know yourself? And a lot of people would say, I know myself pretty well. But when I was in Japan, one of my teachers, who was actually a law professor, when he would introduce Naikan in this kind of a presentation, he would always hold up his hand. He would say, you go through your life, and this is what you see. But everybody else sees this. Right? But you don't see this. And when you do self-reflection, what you're really doing is this. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of other people you're in relationship with. So for example, it's very natural and automatic for me to think, what is it like for me to be married to Linda, right? So I can always think of like what she's doing that bothers me, what she's not doing that bothers me, what she's saying that agitates me. It's just a very natural response we have to the people in our lives, right? But when you do self-reflection, when you do Naikan self-reflection, what you're really doing is turning the question upside down, and the question now becomes, what is it like for Linda to be married to me? Right? And so how can I understand my life and myself by looking at myself through her eyes, right? What is it like for her to have to deal with me as her husband? Yesterday, this past week, this past 3 years. And when we begin to look at the question like that, we see a whole different view of ourselves. And we may realize that, well, maybe we didn't know ourselves as well as we thought, right? You know, we all have people in our lives, often many people, that we see their life from the outside, and we think, why doesn't this person just do this? If they would just do this, they'd get this result, and they wouldn't be struggling so much. I don't understand it. Why don't they just do what's so obvious to do, right? But they don't see it, right? You see it. It's always easy to see it when it's somebody else. But is it possible that someone's actually thinking that about you? Right? Because someone has to be on the other side of that, because we know it happens. So there are people who are watching us in the same way, and they're thinking, I don't understand this person. Why are they acting like this? Why are they doing this that way? So it's very revealing when we start seeing ourselves and using other people's, our relationships with other people as a mirror to see ourselves in. You know, if you think about your physical body, you can't actually see that much of your physical body. I mean, you can try, right? I can see a big part of my physical body. My belly's a little bit too far out here, but I can see a lot of my front, right? I can see most of my arms all the way up to my shoulders, but I can't see my face. I can't see my own eyes. I can't see the back or top of my head. I can't see the whole back of my body, and I can't see anything in terms of the internal topography of my body, right? All my organs, everything that's going on inside, I'm blind to all of that. So, so once we start doing self-reflection, it gives us an opportunity to basically see ourselves often in a more complete way, because we're seeing ourselves through the eyes of someone else. So this questioning spirit is really about going into your self-reflection with an openness to whatever you're going to see, instead of going in there with this kind of clear idea of, oh, this is what's going on in my life. You know, Aristotle, for example, had a questioning spirit. He questioned whether the earth was flat. Pythagoras questioned whether the earth was flat. Magellan questioned whether the earth was flat and then sailed around the world and proved it was round. They all had this questioning spirit. And so our understanding of the shape of the planet that we live on comes from a questioning spirit. The Pandita Aryadeva, who was one of the chief disciples of the great Buddhist teacher Nagarjuna, said that just to question whether things are as they are, can shake the very foundations of habitual clinging. Just questioning something itself can shake the very foundations of the thing itself. And so if you can go into this process with this questioning spirit, that's, I think, the most important thing that you can do in order to basically have it be meaningful and useful to you. So having said that, I'm going to give you the first question, and what I'm going to ask you to do is to take 5 minutes and write down, if you have something to write on. It's better if you write, but if you don't, you can, there's actually a few pens up there. If you need a pen, we can pass one around. Otherwise, just keep it in your head. But it's a little better in this situation if you can write. Take 5 minutes and write down your answers to the question. And then I'm not going to ask anybody to share anything. If you want to volunteer and share 1 or 2 items from your list, you can, but this is really yours. And so just be honest. So the question that I'm going to ask you to look at is, what have I received from others? And this is the first question in the 3 questions of Naikan reflection. So I'm going to give you a period to look at. And in this case, we'll make it very simple, which is the period I'd like you to examine is the last 24 hours of your life. Okay? So from approximately 5:30 yesterday until right now. And the question is, what have I received from others for this from this 24-hour period? And try to be very precise, concrete, and detailed. In other words, I received Linda driving down from Vermont to Northampton. I received coffee from the gas station. I received the use of my eyeglasses so I could see more clearly today. I received the hotel room at the Northampton Hotel, very nice hotel room to stay in. So very concrete kinds of things. Stay away from abstract concepts like I received support. I received care. I received, there's no, support isn't real. Right? Care isn't real, it's a concept. But how did that person support you? Right? How did that person care for you? Then you get down to the nuts and bolts of reality. So that's what you're looking for. You can look at what people gave and did for you. You can look at objects. So make as long a list as you can about what you received. If we can have silence for 5 minutes, and then I'll let you know when 5 minutes is up. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there. So is there anyone who has maybe 1 or 2 items from their list just to give us an example of what you came up with?
Music
Yes.
throughout the day.
Music throughout the day? Okay, good. Anything else? Something you received yesterday? Yes?
An opportunity to exchange loving touch, healing touch.
Opportunity to exchange loving touch, healing touch. Okay. One more, yes?
My roommate got out of bed to shut the lights off last night.
Uh-huh.
Neither of us like to do that because the switch is on the other side of the room.
Okay, great. That's a great example. Yes?
Do you mean in the abstract or a specific thing? Do we see?
A specific thing. Maybe somebody opened the door for you, for example.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Do you include how people behave in the highway?
Sure.
You're receiving something from them.
Yeah.
You're getting a message.
Mhm. Right. So the spirit of the question is when we say, "What did you receive?" The spirit of the question is something you benefited from. So if someone, for instance, gave me breakfast this morning and it had bacteria in it and I threw up, I probably wouldn't put that on my list as something I received, even though technically I received it. But the spirit of the question is something I benefited. So when we drove down this morning, for instance, we received the safe driving of other people on the road. We received really wonderful service from these big plows and sanders, that were keeping the highway clean and helping to control the ice because it was very icy last night. So yeah, I think just driving, you're receiving something from other people. Okay, anyone else? Yes?
Yeah. So I'm guessing, what you just said helped clarify, because I
Uh-huh.
was kind of confused over, because when that's phrased, what I received from somebody, it
Right.
like kind of implies this person like deliberately directed
Mhm.
or had me in mind in their intentionality when they did something.
Right.
But like often that's not the case, but
That's
you
right.
benefit from so many things without that. So
Mhm.
you need to take that concept out of this question, and it's only like whatever you've benefited from rather than
Right.
the other person's intentionality.
Yeah, and that's a very astute point because it's one of the distinctions. For instance, this question alone you would find in positive psychology. You would see it in gratitude journaling. It's a big element of positive psychology these days. But the phrasing of this is purposely, what did I receive, not what did somebody give me, right? So even if you found a $20 bill on the floor, because it's dropped out of someone's pocket and you don't know whose it was, so it's yours, that's something you received, right? Doesn't have anything to do with the other person's intention. If you got a benefit from it, then you would put it down.
Okay.
The other thing that's about this is it's not asking what you're grateful for, because the focus of that question is on your feelings, right? This is really trying to look at the objective reality. Somebody gave me a cup of coffee, right? Whether I'm grateful for it or not depends a lot on how much sleep I got last night and whether I'm in a good mood or a bad mood, but the objective reality is I received a cup of coffee. So the question is really trying to look specifically at just the kind of factual reality of your relationships and your situation, and it's phrased to simply say, what did you receive? Yes?
I feel like right now we're receiving the warmth of this building on a rainy day,
Mhm.
this lecture from you,
Mhm.
the lights in the room, these
Sure.
comfortable chairs.
Mhm.
All of that is so easy to take for granted.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as soon as we shift our attention, as you just did, right, we realize that just sitting here, we're receiving amazing things, right? As you just started to list, oxygen to breathe, right? Electricity. I mean, it's incredible when we make that shift of attention. And most of the time during the course of our day, we don't, because most of the time what we're picking up and noticing is problems and difficulties, right? And our attention shifts over there, and we can sit in a room and never realize, wow, it was nice to have a chair that had cushion on it instead of a hard chair. But when we make that shift of attention, which is prompted by this question, it opens up the possibilities of noticing exactly those things. So I want to read you a little story from my book. It's a true story. I had dinner with Kathy in New York recently. Kathy's an attractive woman in her late 50s who I've known for many years. During the course of our dinner, Kathy proceeded to report on each of the key people in her life and describe how they were not meeting her needs and expectations. One of her good friends had failed to invite her to dinner, even though some other mutual friends had been invited. Her daughter and son-in-law didn't allow her enough time with her newborn grandchild. Her business partner wasn't attending to his work properly. Her husband had lost interest in making love to her, and her son hadn't even sent her a birthday card. There were several others who fell short of her expectations. As she reported her stories, I could see how much she was suffering. Just talking about all the people in her life this way resulted in an experience of suffering. I doubt that she even noticed what she was eating and who was serving it. Kathy has an idea of what the ideal friend would do, say, think, feel, and give. And she has a similar image of the ideal son and daughter and husband and colleague and waiter and grocery clerk and auto repair person. Each day she searches for her image of the ideal. Each day she experiences reality. And each day she focuses her attention on how reality fails to meet her image of the ideal. She's mastered the recipe for depression and disappointment. She's discovered a guaranteed formula for suffering. Over the years, she's trained her mind to focus on the gap between her ideal of the world and the reality, and her mind has graduated with honors. It operates this way with less effort than it takes Kathy to brush her teeth. So Kathy suffers as each day brings her more disillusionment. With every story, she reaches out for sympathy, but the sympathy others offer her pales in comparison with her ideal of the sympathy she wants. How often have our minds played this same game? How often have we sunk into disappointment and resentment because others fell short of our ideals? We occupy a moment in time and a few cubic feet in space in a universe that is both timeless and without boundaries. And yet we believe that the universe should conform to our ideals. Can we be so arrogant as to think that such a cosmic speck is capable of knowing what is truly ideal? As long as we hold fast to our ideal of what we deserve from the world, we blind ourselves to the gifts that we're receiving. We look back on our childhood and notice what could have been done for us and given to us that we think would have made us happier. And the gap between our reality and our ideal of what it should have been like attracts our attention like a magnet. But to focus on this gap is to miss most of reality. We miss the countless moments when we were perfectly cared for and attended to. We trade the reality of how we were loved for the illusion that we should have been loved more and better. It's an unworthy exchange that leads to spiritual and emotional bankruptcy. When I narrow my vision to search for an ideal that my mind has created, life seldom complies. But when I broaden my vision to simply notice what life is offering, I find I'm surrounded by an abundance of care and support. And yet we can repeatedly observe the mechanics of a mind that is rarely satisfied with what it has at the moment because it's always yearning for some manufactured ideal. We can witness eyes that scan reality for what they want, failing to see what they're being offered. Such awareness is the first step in retraining ourselves to truly open to the gifts that the universe is offering us. Have you ever seen a young child who has a single rigid idea of what he wants for Christmas? On Christmas morning, he rapidly unwraps all his gifts, looking for the single gift his mind has targeted. And in the absence of that item, he cries, sulks, and pouts as he walks away from the Christmas tree in disappointment. And in his wake, he leaves all his presents abandoned and unappreciated. How often does this pouting, spoiled child surface in our own daily encounters with life? How many gifts have we left lying under the Christmas trees of our past? How many presents remain unwrapped because we fail to even notice their presence? Take a moment, Kathy, to reclaim your gifts and abandon your ideal images. You have it backward. Open your eyes and see how many gifts there are to unwrap. Notice the presence of your presence. It's not your life that is disappointing. It's your mind. This is a quote, an Ojibwa quote, a Native American quote. Sometimes I go about in pity for myself, and all the while a great wind is bearing me across the sky. So let's do the second question. There's 3 questions in Naikan, so you've done 1. The second question is, what have you given to others? Right? So you can think about this. We're looking at the same period, 24 hours. Maybe you made somebody dinner. Maybe you fed your cats. Maybe you opened the door for somebody, gave them a back massage, gave them a ride someplace, right? Would all be practical examples. Again, concrete practical things that you gave or did for someone else. So if you can take 5 minutes, try to kind of replay the film of the last 24 hours and see what you can come up with in terms of what you actually gave. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there. So I want to do a little survey. This time I actually do want you to raise your hands if you're willing to. So you've got two lists now, right? What you received and what you gave. You examine the same exact period of your life, one day of your life. And so there's three possibilities. One is that during the last 24 hours, because your data is just for 24 hours, so you can't draw conclusions beyond that. But during this 24-hour period, you received more than you gave. That's one possibility. Second possibility is that during this period, you gave more than you received. And the third possibility is that it came out exactly equal. Right? So one of those three things. So I'm going to ask you, take a survey, and just through raising your hands, we'll kind of see how that came out. Before you do that, I want you to look at your lists carefully, because I don't want you to just look at the quantity of the items on each side, but the quality in terms of their value to you or other people. So for example, you might have one item on things that you gave. You just did one thing yesterday, which is you rescued a puppy from an icy river or something like that. And if that was the only thing, it might be that you actually gave more than you received, just because that was such an important thing to save that life. So it's not necessarily about quantity, but that's part of it. So as you think about this and look at your lists, or if your lists are in your mind, so the first possibility is, how many of you would have a sense that yesterday, the past 24 hours, you received more than you gave? Raise your hands. Okay, so quite a few people. Right, and just be honest. So how many of you would say the past 24 hours that you gave more than you received? Okay, maybe one person, a couple people. And how many of you would say that it really just was a wash, just came out perfectly the same? Okay, so handful of people, yeah, maybe about 8, 9 people like that. Good. So this is kind of a reconciliation. And it determines, if it turns out that you received more than you gave, then at least from that day, you go into the next day with a debt, right? You're in debt. If it turns out that you gave more than you received, then the world owes you. Right? Or it's just equal. Yes?
Yes, sorry, but another
That's
question.
okay.
Because like we specified that with what we've received from the world, it doesn't have to be like people intentionally giving to you.
Right.
So likewise, in order to make like a fair assessment of
Right.
the balancing between the two, you had to have this question also be symmetrical to that, right? So, but it's really, I think it's really hard to estimate what you've done that people have received, and they've received that unintentionally. I feel like that is more difficult to gauge compared to knowing what you've received from people doing things unintentionally. So I think in that sense, it's like really difficult to make a fair evaluation of this because of the asymmetry of the biases.
Yeah,
So.
and I think it's a fair point. I think it can be more difficult, but my sense is, having done this a lot, that you could still kind of make somewhat of an assessment of those kinds of things, because it's also difficult, I think, sometimes to recognize what you've received from people who didn't intend to give it to you. But part of the process of this, and one of the things that I really have found very valuable, is that it's a very simple process. And so the man in Japan, Yoshimoto Ishin, who developed this back in the 1930s, and it actually was based on an ancient Buddhist practice called Mishirabe that had been done for several centuries before that by Pure Land Buddhists. But the questions, as you can tell, are very simple. So we've worked with children as young as 4 or 5 years old, with our own children, in fact, included, as a way of promoting self-reflection in children. And what he would say is, if you're looking at something and you're not sure about it, just go on to something you're sure about. In other words, don't get caught up in the kind of mental gymnastics of trying to figure out specifically or precisely something. Just go on to what you're actually confident or sure about. So I do think that it's a good point, but I think it's something that if we just simply stick with it in a very kind of straightforward way, that my wife drove me down here and I got her coffee. Those are just kind of simple realities of our life. But I understand your point, and I think it's well taken. So if you were to do this, for instance, for another 364 days, you'd have a year's worth of data, right? And you'd have a sense of whether you were in debt to the world, whether the world's given you more, or whether you've given more, right? And the world was in debt to you. And I would suggest that most of us go through our life kind of unconsciously based on the idea that the world owes us. And it's not that we think that, it's not that that thought's present all the time, it's just the way that we live, So we try to get the closest parking space in the mall, and we try to make sure that if we're paying for our dinner that the food is hot, and we want a raise or a promotion, or we want to make sure that we get a piece of pie before they run out of it in the all-you-can-eat buffet or something like that. we kind of behave in a way that we're trying to get more. Right? And what I found is that going through this process, that if you actually recognize that, that you've received more from the world than you've given, that there's a natural response in many people to want to give something back. Right? And if you're doing Naikan reflection on a person rather than a time period, if I'm reflecting on my mom or my wife or my teacher, and I feel like there's this kind of imbalance because I've received so much, there's a natural response to try to give something back. In the 12-step program, there's a step for making amends, right? But in Naikan, there's no step for doing anything. The idea is this is just about seeing. And then when you see something, you have a natural response to what you're seeing. And in many cases, when we see that somebody's done a lot for us, and we haven't done very much in return, we just naturally move to try to pay something back, to give something back. And we've had people do Naikan on the environment. And people are moved when they realize what they receive from nature and the environment to want to give something back in a way that you're not naturally moved when you don't recognize that, right? We can legislate about throwing trash on the ground or about keeping down their carbon footprints and things like that. But to me, this is the most powerful way to influence people, is basically when they can see what they're receiving from others. So this came up with my dad when I did Naikan on him. So in a retreat, you go through your whole life with a person, right? So I started from the beginning of my life, when I was born, till my current age at the time, looking at my relationship with my dad, and by the end, there was this huge imbalance in the giving and receiving. And a part of that was financial, because not only had my dad paid for things when I was a child and helped pay for things when I was an early adult, but whenever I would see him, he would always pick up the check at a restaurant. He'd come to visit me, and we'd go to Home Depot, and he'd always pay for construction materials if I was fixing up my house. And so when Linda and I were getting married about 25 years ago, he was coming out early, and we thought, let's take him to Montreal, and we'll pay for the whole trip for a weekend. And he would never let us do that, so we'll just pay for it all in advance, right? So this was my strategy for trying to repay my dad, right? Is to take him on this trip and pay for the whole thing. So he comes out, we go up to Montreal for the weekend, everything is paid for in terms of the lodging and stuff, and we paid for most of the restaurants. One time he picked up the check. We didn't want to make a spectacle in the restaurant, so we let him pay, but it was really the only exception. And we get back, and the next weekend is our wedding. And my dad is a blue-collar kind of guy. I grew up in Chicago. He's a blue-collar guy, didn't have much money. And after the wedding, he kind of comes up to us, and he gives Linda a hug, and he gives me a hug, and he says, here's a wedding present. He hands me an envelope. And in the envelope, there's 2 checks for $500 each. And I said to my dad, you don't have this kind of money. What are you doing? And he said, well, I was going to give you $500 as a wedding present, and the other $500 is for Montreal. And so here's the thing. We didn't even spend $500 on him in Montreal. So after all of that, I come out deeper in debt than had I not even taken him to Montreal in the first place. So the question of whether we can pay back a debt to a person or to the world or to a community is not a question you can answer in your head. It's a question you can only answer in your life by trying to do it, right? If you actually try to pay back your mom or your dad or your partner or whatever it is, then you find out whether it's possible or not. But it's not something that we can figure out in our head beforehand. Yes?
I have been, for the last number of years, have been sort of recognizing, because of various circumstances, that sometimes to receive is actually giving a gift to those who receive. To give, because it gives them pleasure, it makes them feel confident, it's a way of caring, and vice versa. But often in giving, it's not so separate. It's receiving at the same time. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, and I think that particularly when we think of it in spiritual or religious terms, the idea that, anytime you're giving something, we often feel a certain satisfaction and joy in giving, right? So we're getting something out of that. So I totally agree with you. And I also believe that looking at this process in a very concrete way, right, is really important in that sense. So because of the time, I'm going to tell you what the other question is. You can do this on your own if you want. We won't have time to do it here. The third question is, what troubles and difficulties have I caused others? Yeah. And this is actually, of the three questions, the most important question. It's the hardest question, the most important question, and the question that most people want to avoid. The question that we really are okay with is, what troubles and difficulties of other people cause me, right? So you don't have to do a retreat to basically know that, because most of us are really good at paying attention to that. But the reason this is so important is because this is the question that gives us the opportunity to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, right? So when I look at how have I caused trouble to my wife, to really answer that elegantly, I have to basically imagine what her experience is. I have to put myself in her shoes. What was it like for her to be on the other end of this experience with me, right? And that's what empathy is, right? The ability to understand the other person's experience. So the question, what troubles and difficulties I've caused, is a question that gives us an opportunity to empathize with another person, another human being, to understand their suffering, their problems, their difficulty, their frustrations, but not just in some generic way, but as it relates to dealing with me, right? So if we do this well, we're really empathizing and understanding the other person's experience when we answer that question. But it's not an easy thing to do. One of the maxims we have in Naikan therapy is, find compassion for others in your own transgressions. Right? So when I go through self-reflection and I look at all of my limitations, my faults, things that I've done in my life that have been very selfish or mean or ego-centered, and then when I'm in that state and I see somebody else who's messing up or even doing something that's unethical or immoral, I have a softer response to that than I do when I feel very self-righteous, like I'm doing a great job and look at this person over here messing up. And I think a lot of our judgmental nature and a lot of our self-righteousness comes from our unwillingness to look honestly at what we've done in our own life. But when you look at those things that you've done, the things that you're least proud of, the things that you're most ashamed of, right? It actually softens your heart towards other people. It's much harder to be self-righteous and judgmental when you're aware of the suffering that you've caused someone, particularly somebody who's loved you. So, so there's so many reasons why this question is so important, and it's a question that is left out of most other kinds of Western methods. But it's a critical question, and if we actually looked at the Buddhist roots of this, which we won't do today, but which we could, you know, one of the essential principles of Shin Buddhism, of Pure Land Buddhism, is that seeing our own ego-centeredness, our own, they use this term bono. Bono is like everything wrapped into one, you know, 5-letter word. So bono is your ego-centeredness, your selfishness, your anger, your meanness. That's your bono. And seeing your own bono, in the real bono of your life, what you've actually done when you've kind of been in that state, is not only important, but it's essential to spiritual awakening. In other words, recognizing this, the dark side of yourself, is essential to a spiritual awakening from a Buddhist standpoint. So it's another aspect of why this is so important. In Shin Buddhism, it's Shin Buddhism that especially clarifies the basic self-centeredness of man. In fact, it teaches not only that man perpetually creates countless self-centered acts, but that awakening to this truth is essential to his well-being. So I'm going to stop there, and I just want to end with a poem, one of my favorite poems, by Billy Collins. It's a poem called The Lanyard. Everybody know what a lanyard is? The other day I was ricocheting slowly off the blue walls of this room, moving as if underwater from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to envelope lying on the floor, when I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one into the past more suddenly, where I sat at a workbench in a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid long, thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift for my mother. I had never seen anyone actually use a lanyard or wear one, if that's what you did with them, but that didn't keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many sick rooms, lifted spoons of medicine to my lips, laid cold face cloths on my forehead, and then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and to swim. And I, in turn, presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said. Here's clothing and a good education. And here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here's a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs and bones and teeth, 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here, I wish to say to her now, is a smaller gift, not the worn truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took that 2-tone lanyard from my hand, I was sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing that I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. Thank you. So Phil, do we have time for a question or two, or should we? Yeah, so we can do a couple questions, and then for people who want to go to the reception, we can talk there. Yes? Did you raise your hand? Yeah, go ahead.
So something that always comes to my mind with these sorts of ideas of looking in and seeing, like, weighing what you gave the universe versus what the universe gave you is something with, when it comes to mental illness, when someone is in a deep depression, it's really hard for them, almost impossible sometimes, depending on how deep in they are, for them to see, oh, I did give something. So maybe what would a suggestion be for people in those moments? Like, would it be helpful to have someone who's guiding you through this practice say, okay, tell me everything that you did in this past day, and I will help you find these things that I think you could, that mean you gave back to someone?
Okay. Well, a couple things I can answer. First of all, my wife, who's a social worker, actually ran several psych rehab centers, one in New York and one in Vermont, where she used this material with people with mental illness. So you should talk to her afterwards in terms of getting more detail. But what I can tell you is, someone probably who's in a deep depression, initially I probably wouldn't give them Naikan as kind of the intervention of choice. However, people with other forms of mental illness, this can be perfect. There was a man that I knew, for instance, who had schizophrenia, and he had a few hours a week job at a little coffee stand someplace. And part of what was going on with him is he thought he was the Messiah. And he did Naikan. And one of the troubles he caused is he gave the wrong change to people. And he realized the Messiah wouldn't do that. The Messiah would know how to get the right change to people. So maybe he's not the Messiah. So actually it helped ground him. It's an example of how it helped ground him. But Linda's used both Naikan and Morita therapy with people with mental illness a lot, probably more than anyone in the United States. So she'd be a great person to talk to. But the other thing I want to respond to is that kind of one of the basic principles when I train people to do this work with other people is you never want to do someone's Naikan for them. And you probably all have been in the situation where you have or have had someone else do that, because those situations are things like, you're feeling really down and depressed, and somebody's coming saying, why are you so depressed? You have a great life. You have this nice house. You have a good job, and you know how much that helps, right? Zero? So Naikan is giving the person the question, right? What did you receive as a question? And they have to then reach in and find those things. And that's what's going to make a shift or not for that person. But we never want to actually be helping them do that. We want to provide the questions. And again, Linda has done this with people who are bipolar and borderline personality disorders and things like that. And it can be very effective, but it's not something you would give to everybody at a particular moment. But certainly with people with mental illness, I've seen it be incredibly effective, along with Morita therapy, which is kind of the other Japanese psychotherapy. Yes?
It's kind of funny, but like Bodhisattvas are really big, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, right? It made me kind of think, like, maybe the Buddha actually was, like, saying, helping the people along, because you think, why did somebody go from, like, selfish life to all of a sudden, I am just going to survive just for the benefit of all other beings? Like, that's a really big leap. But if you look at it from all the past lives of how much they've received up to that point, like eons and eons, then it's like, oh my God, even giving, for another eon to everybody else still isn't going to make up for all the past received.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I could say much in terms of what motivates bodhisattvas to be bodhisattvas, but I think that just in terms of human beings, what I see is that when people who realize how much they're loved and cared for, and they don't realize it because they're told that, they realize it from their own reflection, are much more likely to want to give something back than people who have the attitude that life is a fight and it's there to kind of like just wear you down. You constantly have to be struggling against it. And the difference between those two attitudes is really our mind and our heart. So when I was doing this work early on in my career, I was working with refugee children in a camp on the Cambodian border. There was Theravadan monks there, and when they was chatting with them, and I was talking about this kind of Japanese psychology, and they said, would you give a talk in the camp for people on Naikan? And so I said, sure. And I didn't realize when I said sure that I was going to be talking to people who had almost nothing, right? Because most of the audiences I talk to are people like you, and you have something. But these were people who had been displaced from Cambodia, in many cases had entire families that had been murdered by Pol Pot, were living in huts with dirt floors. I'm thinking, like, can they really work with this material and actually feel grateful or be aware of what they're receiving? But I'd kind of committed to it, so I gave the talk, and I did the same thing. We went through the questions, and the content of their answers, in terms of the first question, was different, but the results were the same. They said one of the things that we receive is these big trucks, tank trucks, bring in fresh water so we have healthy drinking water every day, right? And the United Nations provides us with rice and basic food, right? And they just went on and on. So even people who were living at a level of like extreme poverty were able to use these questions and still have a sense of appreciation for their situation. And it kind of raises what I think is a really interesting point psychologically, and that is that I call it the myth of circumstances, and it's the idea that the way to happiness is to improve our lives, right? Improvement in the sense of, getting a nicer house, if we're single, finding a partner that we can have a life with, getting a better job, getting more money. All of these kinds of things have to do with changing our circumstances, right? But so much of the research points to the fact that people who are lottery winners aren't actually any happier 2 years down the road, even though they won the lottery. And going in the other direction, people who have had an accident and are paraplegic aren't any less happy 2 years down the road than before their accident. And so circumstances, changing our circumstances, there's no evidence that that's actually going to make a big difference in terms of our happiness. But we work so hard on doing that. But the difference is really working on the way we see our life and the way we understand life and the way we understand ourselves, right? It's the internal work on our mind and our heart that's going to change our experience, not the external circumstances. And yet, think about the huge investment we make in circumstances and the very minimal investment we make in terms of working with our heart and our mind. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation and everything. I have like one kind of basic concern, which is that like the model on which like the inherent metaphor behind all of this is like a transaction model, like giving, receiving, like the whole, even that slide with like a bank balance.
Right.
And I guess like there are various ways that one could be motivated to be generous and to do things for others. Like another and I just like have some worries that if you focus exclusively on this transaction model as a metaphor, that can like reduce like the possibilities of motivators for generosity, because I feel like an alternative like model, for example, would be just like if you ask yourself like, in what ways are the people who are around me suffering, and what ways like can I like reduce that, like that's just not on transaction model at all, but that's just like imagining, that's just like more direct empathy, I feel. And so I guess like I like definitely like this transaction model is very accessible for sure, because it's a very easy metaphor, it's very appealing, like it's everywhere in life, but I just like have some concerns about if this was, especially if this practice Naikan is exclusively based on these 3 questions, it really just centers on the transaction model rather than like other types of basic metaphors that could be used to motivate generosity.
So I understand your point, and I think that it's an interesting term, at the transaction model, which applies to the first 2 questions. If I were your teacher, what I would say is try it and see. Okay? Don't try to figure it out in your head. Figure it out in your life. Go do a week of Naikan, do 100 hours of reflection, and then see what your experience is and what you think about it. So I think that you're suggesting other questions, and I think that there's great potential for other questions. These aren't the only questions that I use in terms of self-reflection, but it is the only questions in Naikan. But there's also historic research about this. For instance, they did research in the prison system in Japan in the 60s. Over 100,000 prisoners in the Japanese correctional system went through an intervention that was 1 week of this kind of Naikan, right, on their whole life. And they looked at 4 different prisons, and they looked at the recidivism rate after those prisoners got out in terms of how many were rearrested. And the difference, the distinction, was not only statistically significant, it was overwhelming. Like at Hiroshima prison, I think, I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head, but it was something like 20% of the prisoners who had done Naikan were rearrested in 2 years. 80% of the prisoners who hadn't were rearrested. And so they used this system in the prison system for years and years, and then the Japanese government didn't like the idea that it was connected to religion, right? Even though it was a therapy, its roots were in Buddhism. So they stopped using it, but now they're actually, they just set up a pilot project a few years ago in China. So they have 3 prisons that have been using it in China. It was so successful that they've now expanded it to 9 prisons, and one of my colleagues over there is working essentially on a proposal which would basically use Naikan in the entire prison system in China. So there's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that it's actually a very valuable model in terms of human transformation and change. So theoretically, I think you're making a very good point. The question is, in reality, is this helpful or is it not helpful? But you know, in both of the Japanese psychologies I'm trained in, Naikan and Morita therapy, there's always this emphasis on direct experience, right? So when you train, it's not learning things from a book or from a lecture, including this lecture. It's have the experience yourself, and then you know in your body, right? You understand it in your body. Okay. Thank you. So we should probably finish up, Phil, you think? Yeah. All right.
So
well, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.
There will be a reception in the Dewey Common Room.